Right, hello everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about forest conservation in southern KwaZulu-Natal. This project was initiated by KZN Wildlife earlier this year. Fieldwork has been ongoing since April and continues today. Sadly, the Midlands spring has halted work for the time being. By means of an introduction, I'm going to talk about why it is that Mistbelt forests pose such a conservation challenge to KZN wildlife in southern KZN. I'm very briefly going to talk about one of the options that has been considered by KZN wildlife and which has prompted the present study. I'll then go into some of the results from our preliminary fieldwork, where we look at first whether or not our forests are degraded and whether this degradation has any impact on above ground standing stock. The study site extends from just south of Pietermaritzburg down to the Eastern Cape border. It's a big area. Forests are widely distributed and they have a diffuse distribution. The most important point here is that most of these forest patches are small. So well over 500 forest patches are less than 10 hectares in size. The landscape is rugged, it's largely inaccessible, it's remote, there are big river valleys in the area. Land tenure is an important issue in dealing with conservation. Surprisingly, KZN Wildlife only manages 11% of the forests in the area. I'm going to talk a little bit about these two here. It's Kalingenwe and Kwaili. We'll remember those names, they come up later. Just as a reference point, this is in Sekeni, big wetland area. Most of the big forest areas in southern KZN are controlled by the state. It's administered through DAF. What's important with these forest areas is that they are managed as timber plantations, mostly pine, so there is some form of a buffer surrounding the indigenous forest patches. By far the overwhelming impact on our forests in the area, however, comes from the local community areas. Even though only 16% of our forest patches fall within community land, well over 75% of the forest patches by area are easily accessible to the communities. Okay, they occur within 1 kilometer of communal land. That leaves us with private land, still quite a big portion, 30% or more. Mostly these are managed by big timber companies, and there's the perception that forests sitting in timber managed land are well preserved or well protected. That's perhaps true due to the restricted access to these areas. Our forests hold important resources for the local communities, particularly in the form of fuelwood for cooking fires, so they make a substantial contribution to the livelihoods of local communities. So a quick summary: conventional conservation does not work in this area. The forest patches are too widely spread, there are too many of them, and it's a very remote region. Because of the high incidence of communal areas, most of the forest patches are certainly vulnerable to exploitation. So this has led KZN Wildlife to seek alternatives. One alternative that's being placed on the table is the global carbon market. These carbon payment schemes are designed specifically to mitigate for climate change by increasing carbon on the ground. They do this by several methods. First of all, to secure big carbon reservoirs. to prevent further forest degradation or deforestation. There's also the recognition that natural forest regeneration or active restoration is an enormous carbon sink, which increases these carbon areas in forests. So there's also the opportunity for, in these payment schemes, for partnerships with local communities, which can lead to hopefully social and economic development or upliftment. That's the general model being investigated by KZN Wildlife, and it's prompted the present study. So our project, we had two objectives. First of all, to assess a selection of forests in southern KZN, asking whether or not they degraded. And then the second phase, which was a more systematic sampling procedure, was to assess whether or not this degradation impacts above ground standing stock. So phase one, it's a rapid assessment. We assigned 1 day to each forest, and we've so far sampled about 20 forests. Forests were selected according to tenure and the surrounding management. Our primary measurement was a tree basal area per unit area, in other words per hectare, which is estimated using a very simple device called an angle gauge. There were various other measurements made, the other important one being the incidence of cut stems in these forests. That's our main result coming from the preliminary rapid assessment. It represents a degradation gradient. Least degraded forests here on the left, down towards most degraded. Just an important point here, what we found was that the angle gauge underestimated forest tree basal area. So these are not, they do not reliably represent absolute values for the forests, but the general scale will be correct. We found very little association with tenure, but the surrounding management matrix does have an impact, and certainly if your forest sits close to a community, it's likely to be degraded. Just the important ones, Kalingenwa and KwaZulu. We'll talk a little bit about those shortly. It's no coincidence that primary forest or old growth forest houses the most above standing stock, above ground standing stock, and that's living standing stock. We didn't measure dead matter at all. In my opinion, primary forest is very rare in KwaZulu-Natal. They recognized by a dominance of podocarps mostly, and the podocarps are enormous. In the background, that's black stinkwood, has a diameter of 1.7 meters. And it's a big tree, but that really represents these old growth forests. The typical Mistbelt forest that we know from the Midlands is dominated by a suite of angiosperms. There's enormous variability in above ground standing stock. I refer to these as secondary forest because most, if not all, are recovering from extensive colonial logging. So they all have evidence of a sawpit. It's a sawpit about 1.3 meters in height or depth. Slip trails are common, and some of them even have roads leading into them. There is some evidence of past disturbance, but none of them show any signs of extensive harvesting of trees. So I have no reason at all to call these forests degraded. Not so for those forests on the extreme right. tree harvesting is common and widespread from all of these forests. Sorry to KZN Wildlife, but I'm picking on Kalingenwe and Kwaili. They're important forests in the area. They are protected. Late 1800s, Forcade already recognized that this was a podocarp-dominated forest. In other words, in my interpretation, it was an old-growth forest. Mike Laws has recently done a fairly detailed study of the forest, where he reports multiple saw pits and slip trails, which would have come from that colonial logging period. Surprisingly, tree basal area is still fairly high, and podocarps are common. The western part of Kalingenwe is presently being hammered. It's most of this area. There's a valley running up here. It's been turned into a fairly dense thicket, and only isolated large podocarps remain. Just for scale, my measuring stick is 1.3 meters long. These are very big trees that have been cut down. It's happening right now. You can go into Kalingenwe right now and there'll probably be 5 woodcutters active, chipping away at these trees. Thankfully it's mostly low tech. Fire is used to kill the trees and to open out the basal stems, which apparently makes it easier to cut. We haven't yet got chainsaws in the area. Kwaili is another protected area running just east. It's in the next valley from Kalingenwe. The situation is far worse here. Degradation has been going on for decades, and I'd suggest the extent of the forest has decreased by well over 500 meters. What's left is a very degraded central area. Again, podocarps are important in this area. I took this photograph last week, and I suggest this tree was felled probably within the last 2 weeks. The shame of it is that the stems are left. So it's really just the branches that are big enough to be carried out that are taken out. So these forests really are littered with these enormous giants that have been felled. This is a community forest just north of Kwaili, and this is what we have to look forward to if the degradation continues. In spite of that, the forest still has enormous trees inside it. So although it's mostly a thicket, probably 4 meters tall, there's still a lot of carbon sitting in these forests. Okay, quickly now, the second phase was systematic sampling of these forests to estimate or provide an accurate estimation of above ground carbon. We used nested plots, and we used the allometric of David Coombs to calculate the carbon. That uses diameter at breast height, tree height and wood density. We used the results from the first phase to inform what forests we would sample. So primary forest was selected because it provides maximum potential of what above ground carbon these forests are able to store. Secondary forest because that's really the typical non-degraded secondary forest. That's the typical forest that we see out here in the Midlands. And it was against these baselines that we compared degraded forests. I've only got to Kwaili. We may or may not, depending on time, assess more. Above ground carbon sits at about 100 tons per hectare. That's low for forest. There's a recent publication from the Eastern Arc Mountains of Tanzania show above ground carbon to sit at about 170 to 180 tons per hectare. David Coombs, studying similar forests in New Zealand, gets a similar figure, about 170 tons. 250 tons per hectare is quite remarkable. It's only one forest. I hope to assess another old growth forest just to see whether it sits within the same ballpark. But that's an exceptionally high value for living above ground carbon in forests. I did prepare my co-author for this result. Degraded forests are not supposed to have the same amount of carbon as non-degraded forests. But the point is, KwaZulu is probably an old growth forest. So it needs to be compared with this one up here. That's as far as we've got. I still need to increase sample sizes for these forests and add one or two forests to our data set. Just to finish off, does the carbon market offer a viable solution to forest conservation in the area? I'm not sure. Quite honestly, it's too early to say. I think we've made a start. To trade in carbon, we need reliable estimates of above ground carbon, which we've started. We need to work out carbon sequestration rates, and I'm looking at my client, telling that's the next stage that we need to work out. We've also identified that these forests provide very valuable resources to local communities, and that really is the issue that has to be dealt with. The social issues in the area are paramount, and if carbon markets offer some solution to local upliftment, then I suggest to KZN Wildlife that the trade in carbon needs to be pursued quite aggressively. Thank you.
Thank you, Hylton. We can take just one quick one, if someone has a burning question. Yes.
Did you consider also looking at saplings and seedlings as part of your definition of what was degraded or not, and another one of the effect of fire?
Fire is important to forests, but certainly not pertinent